Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this session on Shifting the Power for Health Equity, hosted by the Movement for Community-Led Development and the Hunger Project. I'm Gunjan Veda with the Movement for Community-Led Development, and can you all hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you. So I'm Gunjan Veda, and it is my pleasure to be moderating today's conversation. And I use the term conversation very, very intentionally. So I have today with me three very committed, passionate individuals, professionals. We have Crystal Lander, who is the Chief Strategic Engagement Officer with Pathfinder International. We have Chris Collins, who is President and CEO of the Friends of the Global Fight Against HIV, Tuberculosis, and Malaria. A mouthful, but I got it right?
You say friends.
Just friends, great. And we have Mubashir Lua, who is the Associate Director for Advocacy and Africa?
Yeah. Africa CVH program.
And the Global Health Advocacy Incubator. So we have three folks here with us today who are extremely committed and passionate about not just health equity, but about shifting the power. But as all of us who've been doing this work know, no one individual or organization can shift the power. It requires each one of us. So we really want to invite all of you to join the conversation. It will not be a traditional panel, it will be a conversation. And once we start, after they initiate it, we will be coming to everybody to be a part of this. So please join us in that conversation. I work with the Movement for Community-Led Development, and for those of you who don't know, that's a global consortium of 1,500 plus local civil society organizations from around the world and 72 INGOs who are committed to putting communities front and center in development and ensuring that every person has a voice and choice in decisions that affect their lives. Why do I bring that up now and here? Because shifting power, decolonizing, anti-racist practice, localizing, a lot of these different movements that are going around, these are all difficult journeys, and they can often be very, very lonely journeys for people within their organizations. If that is the case and you find yourself feeling lonely or I don't know how to continue, then reach out to the movement. It is a group of individuals who are committed and passionate about exactly this, and you'll know you're not alone. Before we begin today's conversation, I want us to take a moment to reflect on where we are now, where we have come, and how much more the distance that we need to cover. 2 years ago, we were organizing a set of sector dialogues, and this was to convince people who said, yeah, this sounds very nice, but how do you know shifting the power actually is effective? How do you know it has any impact? I think, Chris, you were in our health sector roundtable when we were trying, to convince everybody on why this is sustainable, why this is the way to go. 2 years and a global pandemic later, we are at a point where we are no longer talking about why. We're talking about how. We're talking about what do we need to do to translate this intention to shift power into practice. And we've seen a whole host of alliances being formed. We've seen majority world, traditionally called the Global South, networks coming up. We've seen pledges emerging from networks. We've seen organizations rethinking, about their own setups. And then last year, in November, we heard the USAID Administrator, Samantha Power, make two big commitments. The first, that 25% of all USAID funding will go to local organizations by 2025. Not a new commitment. Those of people who've been in DC for a while or in the sector have heard this before, right? But there was a second part to that commitment, and that was that by 2030, 50% of USAID funding will go to programs that put communities in the driver's seat in either design, implementation, or evaluation. So what we're here to talk about today really is, how does this happen? What does it take for this to happen? What does it take the funders, the foundations, to make this happen, but what does it take from all of us to make this happen? And that's the distance that we have covered from the why to the how. So, Crystal, let me start with you. What is needed? How can organizations and funders like USAID actually translate that intention of being locally led into practice this time around?
Well, first, thank you for being here. Anyone who knows me knows I like to talk about this topic often. So I'm very excited to be with this discussion, as you said. The first couple of things that come to mind for me is, first is countries are diverse. And I get very nervous when I hear these ideas and these pledges and these thoughts, because it's usually coming from a very narrow perspective on what countries look like. And I'll say this, coming from Pathfinder International, we work in 20 countries, and we disproportionately work in Francophone Africa, which is many times left out of the conversation. Their systems are extremely different than Anglophone Africa. And we also have a lot of programs in Mozambique. Lusophone Africa. Most of the people don't even remember they exist. So I say all that to say is you're comparing apples and oranges, and while I am extremely happy to see the US be out front on many of these things and saying we have to do better, we can do better, what I worry about is when they're thinking about that, they're thinking about a Kenya, which is one end of a spectrum, who has systems well developed, has infrastructure well developed. They have a thriving civil society population, not saying perfect, but thriving civil society population who are integrated in, who feel very comfortable demanding what they need. And then we work in a place like Niger, where they're like, we just need to get a basic health care to people so that they're not dying in childbirth. So I think we just have to be careful as we're looking at these ideas that we're championing all those countries on that spectrum, so that we're not putting the wrong solutions for the wrong countries, and also scaring countries to say, wait a second, we still need some support here. We may be well ahead on this one, but we need some support in other areas. The only other thing that I would really say that I hope we do is understand that civil society many times is spending a lot of energy with holding their governments accountable. But governments have to be a part of this conversation. We cannot skip over them. Because if we're saying government should be for their people, representing their people, and you're skipping over them to fund directly to civil society organizations, you have missed a fundamental group that needs to sustain this. We're talking about sustainability. Governments have to be a part of the conversation. Now we know, again, diversity. Governments are quite diverse, and particularly on issues that we work on, sexual and reproductive health and rights, we know that everyone may not always agree with us on that. But we also know that we have to ensure that that care is given. So we have to make sure our government is really advocating and supporting local governments when they do not see that that is going to address all the people. We talked about people with disabilities, LGBT community. We know some governments do not feel like that they can get there, and it's not to stop that advocacy for them to get there, but we need to make sure that that's where we make sure civil society and governments are working together, and we decide how to support them based on where we think that country's needs are. Again, just not a one-size-fits-all model to all of this, and it's not a quick fix. I heard that said just at the plenary session. This is not overnight, and we can't act like it's overnight. So again, things that make me nervous sometimes is when we have these big numbers that come out, and it's about the number, not about the people. The people is why we're doing all this work, and we know that that gets us up every day, but sometimes the people get lost in the big pledge, the big number, so that everyone feels good at the end of the day.
Thank you, Crystal. And I'm sure this is bringing up a lot of things for a lot of people here, so we will get into the conversation on that. Before that, Babashe, so you work with the Global Health Advocacy Incubator, so a lot of advocacy, so I'm sure you have a lot of ideas. What are the 3 concrete things you would say to a USAID or any of these big funders who are talking about becoming more locally led? What do they need to do? Concrete actions.
Yeah, that's thank you again. I think as Crystal said, that's a tough question. Just 3.
We'll start with 3.
So I think. Of course, we've been talking about this for some time, and I think there have been similar commitments during President Obama administration. Also, I think to 30% did not happen. There was a journey to self-reliance during Trump administration through Administrator Green. Did not really materialize much, and here we are. I think one thing civil society organizations, just for civil society organizations, particularly to advocates, to do is, this is just the commitment by administrative power is really a non-binding commitment. It's just a commitment that won't have congressional oversight or maybe less accountability. So I think we want to see these codified by Congress. I think that's really critical. If Congress puts this as a law, administration changes may not affect it. So I think civil society organizations can actually advocate for codifying something like Localization Financing Act, or I don't know, localization strategy, something like that. And I think with that, there will be a clear definition of what localization means, who local actors are. At this moment, there are, I think, I don't know, I counted maybe 5-6 USAID documents. Each of them have, I think, definitions of local actors, and so it's very confusing. But I think it's really important to have conceptual clarity around that, and I think civil society organizations can help with that. I think the other things, the other suggestion I have is we can tell better stories. For far too long, we have been saying, they lack capacity. Local organizations lack capacity there. This tiring trope, right? I think what we can do is we can tell better stories so that funders also are encouraged to do it. Additionally, I also want to say that I think the understanding around localization is that local means cheap. Local does not always mean cheap. I think it's important to focus on building systems, institutional systems. So patience is really important. It's not gonna be quick fix. So I think USAID can treat local organizations the same way it treats international NGOs when it comes to overhead costs and the likes. So I will stop.
Thank you. So some very critical points coming up here, both in terms of systems, right, like financial systems, language, access, the different actors in the ecosystem, the role of local governments, for instance, but also this whole idea of definitions, who is local, and how often there's so many varying interpretations of it and where we get caught in that. And this very important thing that local is not cheap. The whole idea of doing this is not so that we can get some cheap labor out of communities to do this work for free, and so we get more overheads, or there's less money spent here, right? To kind of interrogate those concepts. Chris, let me come to you at this point. The HIV/AIDS movement recognized the value of community leadership long back, and are there any lessons that have come up on a variety of these topics that you hear that are coming up in the conversation now, whether it be around the different systems in different countries? So how do we kind of create a system that is responsive to what the reality of the community is in that part of the world?
Yeah. When I think about HIV, it's almost, I would turn around the question, because to me, it's not as if the HIV movement recognized the importance of community involvement. The HIV movement was community. I mean, the HIV movement was born out of the negligence of governments all over the world, including my government for sure. Our president at the time, Reagan, didn't say the acronym AIDS for years until thousands of people were dead. And in an environment like that, where discrimination comes way before health access, it required communities. I mean, there was nothing there until communities responded. So the HIV movement is more than a recognition. It's owning. It's owning that power. And I think that ultimately is what it takes, is community is decision makers not making it oppositional and not making it an add-on, but making community fully integrated at every level. I mean, in terms of community engagement, I think it has to happen at the level of the board of directors that's directing the big resources, all the way down to national planning, local planning, delivery of services. There needs to be an awareness that we need to be investing in community services that are part of the system for health overall, community-led monitoring. And one thing that we don't talk about, but everyone knows that we depend on, is advocacy, but we don't fund advocacy, right? We expect civil society all over the world to stand up as advocates, but we don't pay for it.
Yeah.
Whereas we pay for just about everything else that we say is really important in the health sector. And this is true for the philanthropy sector, but also I would say for USG and for governments in general, and for multilaterals. You just don't see the investment. You know, you expect folks to be storming the barricades and fighting for change, but you know, it is not. You know, I was saying this to, maybe it was John earlier, but so many times, you know, I see civil society getting invited to meetings, and it's like, okay, you're invited, you're included, but the travel to get there, the time spent being part of it, the time to prep, the support in prepping, very often not provided. So my thought about civil society and community engagement is, first of all, it's not a different pole of the response. It needs to be fully integrated. It has to be integrated at every level. These are not separate things. The movement for health, the movement for UHC, that is a vision of fully integrated community, along with a more comprehensive system for health that includes absolutely a public sector at scale. So that's a takeaway for me. I mean, if we really want to do this, we need to be thinking about it in that integrated fashion. We need to put the money behind it. But the other part of that I would just say is, from the beginning, is community has to own some of that to-do list too, right? They need to stand up and demand it.
That's what you saying.
I was just gonna say, as an advocate, I love hearing that. Yeah, funded, you know, is the one thing that keeps coming up, and we know it needs to happen, but yet every grant report, they're like, oh, this is great. That and communications. We want the storytelling. Let's get out here. Let's talk about our work. Chris made a great point. Is like, it's the packaging. And we talked a little bit about this with all this other work. Who gets invited to the table from civil society is not necessarily the best people. It's the people we can find with the best websites, with a great somebody to answer the phone, and who somebody already knows. That may not be the person doing the rest work. But who's going to do what you said? Who's going to fund them to get from one part of the country to the other part for the meeting? And then they probably were doing this part-time, and who's going to do the other work while they're there? Like, none of that is included, and I think that goes back to localization. And as we were talking, you know, planning this a little bit, is we one of the things that worries me about localization is, which talking to my colleagues in country, was picking and choosing who's local. My colleague is like, I'm Nigerian, but I'm a Nigerian working for an international NGO. Somehow I'm less local than the Nigerian working for a local NGO. And she's like, I graduated to this. I wanted this job. I'm very proud of this job. And we have to be careful that as a funder nation, that we get into deciding who gets to be local, who is worthy, because then we're just picky. So we're doing what we intended not to do. And so we have to be a little bit careful about trying to get quick fixes. It's like, okay, so everyone's local, let's locally register. Well, you know,
Right.
fill in the blank company can register faster probably with a lawyer than some of the other local civil societies who are like, I'm just doing the work. I don't know if I'm registered or not. I do good work. Everyone knows that I'm the people to go to in the community. And then you look on the list, they don't qualify because they don't have a lawyer to register for the paperwork, which we know in some countries can be extremely complicated. But the other company who flew in can do it, put up a nice website, and now they can get the funds. We're indirectly messing up our own process. So some of this is, whoever is planning this out has to have a good knowledge of working in diverse countries and not just one or two, to really say, hey, this is okay, so I see it here, maybe this, here, maybe that, and really like taking it regional. Regional organizations don't fall into local sometimes, but small countries cluster together. That makes sense, and they're building off of these systems that already worked. We already know that some of this worked from the HIV/AIDS movement. Okay, so they're already clustered together, they've been working together, so let's take that and move it forward. Some of them wouldn't even qualify under these local definitions because they weren't registered to one country. And so these are the kind of things that I hope that we're really being thoughtfully sat down, not a race against the clock to say we've done something, let's check this off. Because I think, again, we miss the real people involved in all of this.
Absolutely. I think you missed something very fundamental, right? The thing of what we're still trying to do is that the system that we are currently in was never designed for local organizations, right? It was never designed valuing local knowledge, valuing local leadership, local ownership. And what we're still trying to do is we're trying to tinker with the system to somehow see, now how do we plug in some of the locals to say, oh, we've got them. We now know what we're doing, instead of really trying to design a system which actually put local organizations in the center. It's like we're trying to build capacities of local organizations when in fact we need to build the capacities of the funders and of the bilaterals to be able to work with local organizations, not the other way around, right? Okay, like we said, this is a conversation. We can carry on with this forever. Even in our planning session, I think it went into this long discussion way above, overtime, where we were just talking about these things. But questions, thoughts, comments, concerns, ideas, join the conversation. Yeah? Let's start with you.
I found it really interesting what you said about involving governments. And, as we know from our work on HIV, that can be very, very hard in certain countries where we sometimes even see worsening trends in terms of exclusion and repressive laws, etc., and no space really for civil society and not really an enabling environment to engage. Where, first of all, it means that, certain funding, donor funding will still be critical to support, working populations, etc., in these countries. But then also I was wondering about the how. I mean, how do we involve these governments in such countries? Are we increasing diplomatic dialogue, which we often see at the UN, it's more and more polarized? Are we investing more in community advocacy, or community-led monitoring, but then if there's no space in those countries and if there's danger, how do we move forward? And I was wondering about your thoughts about the how.
Yeah, and I think so look, it's really easy to be here and say a lot of things. I mean, many of us in this field know, in this area know, like Ethiopia is a perfect example. It's a place where I have spent a lot of time personally, and it's difficult to watch it play out. And it's really easy for me to be here and be like, well, we should be advocating this and this should be done when I'm not, I safely live here. So taking that all into play, I do think, remember the 3Ds? We all talked about it. The 3Ds, and that was a period of time we were going to talk about diplomacy, development, diplomat, all that stuff together, I mean, the concept is still good. We do have to work on all of those because the reality is our goal is governments to be able to have the capacity to care for their people. I mean, that's our end goal, that vision, right? But reality is, we know that doesn't look the same everywhere. We know that certain governments just do not allow. I mean, literally, it's illegal for civil society to speak up, speak out. And I think in those cases, we do rely a bit on behind-the-scenes diplomacy while strengthening civil society. And to be honest, strengthening civil society has been giving them the money to do what they need to do. I think for other countries where the governments may just be less in the forefront or may not be just paying attention, or this is not their number 1 or 2 issue. We think it should be, but it should be, moving it up. I think that comes into moving it up to scale. We've also seen a bait and switch a little bit. It's like, well, if you take care of health, then we don't have to, and we'll move over into these other things. Yeah. And I think that's a couple of countries where we need to be like, no, we're not doing this. We have to have a shift where we create some balance and some longevity. But I think that's where that diversity of looking at the countries comes into play, and civil society in those countries, and really looking at what countries need, and being able to support the efforts to do that. Again, working with some governments that I've worked with directly, it's been amazing because they have been the champions. They have said, to members of Congress here, we need support. We need you to speak up on this so that we can better position members of ministers of health need that backup. I mean, they're still part of the democracy. I mean, the part of the bureaucracy in a country. So I think we can support and bolster them a little bit more, if in some cases. But then as some, heads of states and different things like this may not be a priority. So I think really looking at the countries and really focusing on, again, their needs. I love the idea of the system wasn't built for them. It was built for us to hand out money this direction with basically, we pretend like we want your opinion, but we send it out. Now it's like, we want your opinion, but we're like, where do we do with your opinion in this system? It's really not a little area for opinion part. And it struck me like we really have to figure out the other direction and figure out how to make this work. Because we talked about this my favorite thing is we have a very US constructed aid system, right? For lack of a better word, not just reading words in English, but concepts in English. And we all know this if you've ever not been a development person and get into that side and you start reading proposal and you're like, oh, I don't understand what is happening. You're like, I have a graduate degree and I don't understand what you're asking me. But now we're asking people in another country, another language, another custom to understand what this is and be like, and could you give it back to me by next Friday? And then, and perfectly format it, and then I'll get back to you, and then I'll just throw you money. And you're like, no, I don't understand what you even want from me. And I think that's how the system is not built for that. And I think just simply saying we're going to give you money without saying, well, wait a second, I don't understand what I'm supposed to do and how you're holding me responsible for this. Again, gets me to the worry, because then they were like, oh, it didn't work. See, it didn't work. They couldn't do it. And they're like, no, they couldn't do it because the system is not really responded to their needs. And I think that happens with the government to government funding the same exact way.
Yeah, and just maybe to quickly add to that it also sometimes in countries like, for example, South Africa, there is more space with, for example, local authorities or, not maybe going central government, but going more to the regions and or with the legal system, so to be more clever that way and just it's not the government, right? It's
multiple governments depending on the country.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And just to add on what Crystal said, we work in different contexts as Global Health Advocacy Incubator. We work in Ethiopia, Kenya, where civil society organizations have better competency and capacity, where you have also Ethiopia on the other spectrum, where civil society organizations really are, especially when it comes to advocacy, are crippled because of the law, government policies that were there in between 2009 and 2018. Local civil society organizations were not allowed to receive funding from donors to do advocacy. Imagine that's a 10-year duration. But in a context like that, also you can still find local civil society organization that local civil society organizations that are passionate about the issue, especially public health advocacy, and have some systems in place, but can be supported in terms of like providing technical support or providing grants and all that, because they have the local knowledge, right? They have relationships, they have credibility, they know how to navigate the cultural context. For example, we do food policy advocacy in Ethiopia. In some countries you can frame that as human rights issue. You may not be able to do that in Tanzania or Ethiopia, but there are other issue framing ways that local civil society organizations do, which we don't really know from 10,000 feet here and so on and so forth. So I just want to add that perspective.
Oh, Chris, you want to add something on this one, or otherwise we'll go to the hand at the back?
Just that I think we need to press the US government as a donor and other governments to specify minimum requirements in terms of community engagement. I think that needs to be spelled out. PEPFAR says what it needs to look like to engage civil society in their country operational planning process. They stipulate now when civil society groups need to get access to data ahead of time so that they can go into the meeting and be prepared. it's those kinds of things that I think that if we can stipulate those things, and in many environments, it's just going to be extremely tough. But the more we as a donor can be very clear about what we expect in terms of engagement and decision making, and enabling that, I think that's really additive. There was a study done by Georgetown 3 years ago, looking at governance measures in countries that got a lot of global fund money and countries that got a little or no global fund money. And lo and behold, the improvement in a number of governance measures were better in global fund, heavily funded countries. And one can, imagine why that is. In part is because the Global Fund is very clear about what governance looks like that involves multiple stakeholders. And so it is, with its millions that it's bringing into a country, it's setting a standard there that hopefully can bleed out and affect larger systems. That's the hope. But I think if we can really finance systems that are clear about how to engage communities, it can bleed out to society more generally. And it's also then supports civil society in getting the experience they need to do other stuff.
Absolutely. Yes, please.
Sorry, I'm gonna stand up because they're probably seeing me back there. I am coming from this from a very different perspective. I work in biotechnology, and I specifically work for a startup that has a technology that can remove the need for cold chain in pharmaceutical and vaccine supply chain, all the way to last mile delivery. I'm personally interested in trying to engage community leaders to understand their needs for something like our technology, or more generally the pharmaceutical supply chain. Is there a way for companies to do that, or do we pretty much have to go through governmental organizations in order to do so, in order to get more information?
There's 100 ways. I mean, absolutely. No, and I greatly appreciate your question. I don't know that you have to choose. I think you can do both, but you definitely can go. Think of an organization like Wacky Health, which is doing health advocacy around Africa. I would go to them like tomorrow and ask them this question. If they're not able to help you, I know they can point you to a place. There's organizations like that that are regional, that are active in a lot of places, that are engaged in partnerships all over their region. Wacky Health is just one example that, can be a real resource to you.
Now, ditto, Chris, and add on that depending on where you're going, you want to engage the government. Of course, the U.S. mission in the country, if you're a U.S.-based company, is always a great place. The people who work there know who's legit and who's not. And they'll tell you, they may be a front organization, or these are really good. They have the capacity here. They work in these places. So again, the good thing is, for lack of better, U.S. can create a lot of systems. We like systems, and many of our systems in many of the countries work. It's just that translating and allowing other countries to do their systems to work for them is always the balance. But I definitely think taking advantage of those in countries, and they have private sector engagement people who work in missions, who are great starting points. And then, like Chris said, there are so many organizations that work regionally who can really help you with saying, if you're going to do something in this region, you need both countries to look at, because the border is so fluid, different things like that.
It's funny, you're right. I think part of our culture is to like systems and to make system level change. So why don't, on a political level, why don't we like health systems?
That's true. That is true.
It's not a rhetorical question. I don't know.
I don't know.
And I have been wondering, so I'm from India. I've spent all my life there, and you think about the US in so many various ways as being, as epitomizing so many values when you're sitting, in the majority world. And you come here and you exactly discover that, Chris, that, but they don't even have a health system that's functioning. Wow. And we're going around the world saying this is how the health systems should be, instead of asking and understanding what is the health system that's best suited for that country, for that community, in that. And a lot of what I'm hearing in this discussion today is that ecosystem approach, that whether it's the local government, whether it's the private sector, whether it's the civil society, whether it's just communities and community leaders, each of them have an important part, and it's an integrated approach that we are looking at. We cannot think of just working with one or the other player, or we cannot design a system that's only for one or the other. Of course, the current system is for none of them. It's for us. That's a different story. But anyone else has, yeah?
My question, I'm leading on the whole idea of systems. This is for everyone in the panel. What would you say to organizations that are based in the US who are slightly losing their mind about locally led development, which personally I think isn't that what you should have been doing anyway, but that's neither here nor there. That, well, you know, we have a lot of processes, they're flow down from USAID, so in order for us to, let's say, give a grant to this locally led organization, we may have to go to basically help them change their whole capacity so they can like respond to a grant properly, or write a proposal, or be a proper subcontractor so that they have all the deliverables. Because it's not us, we answer to USAID. It's USAID that has to change their processes. So how would you advise a company like that, or an organization that says, our processes are hard, yes, they're complicated, yes, but they're all flow down from USAID, and how do we go from there?
Thank you. That is a fantastic question, because I think it was something that we started out with, right? That shifting power requires each of us, and it's very easy to point fingers and to say we can't do it because, but all of us do have a role, and all of us do accentuate these power asymmetries that exist, right? So let's start with you, Crystal.
Yeah,
What
I mean,
do organizations
I worked for
like-
Pathfinder International. I worked for Management Sciences for Health. I worked for SETPA, which is funny enough different, because I remember going from SETPA to MSH, and SETPA had one huge USAID grant, and you know, we were happy moving along, you know, doing our little work, and then I went to MSH, and I'm like, oh, this is what a BD team looks like. I mean, we had 2 teams, 2 places, and I mean, it was a machine. I mean, very smart, but it was a different level. And I will say, as someone who works in advocacy and comms, that's where my background is from, and looking at business development and going into that space, I will say respectfully, it is a system. Now, let's make no mistake. NGO world, health, this is a system, and it's any system that goes off of a government is going to be a system. People learn how to do it and do it well, and they master it, and that's why, you know, you can win. That's what you do, and then other people don't. Now let's start from the fact that the system is also, again, was not created to be locally led. So organizations were not created to be locally led, and the systems were not created to be locally led. And some have done better with shifting than others. I would say one of the things that we're doing is, which is interesting, is we're trying to flatten out so that this whole mindset of like US and the rest of the world doesn't come up, and that it's a little bit of flattening. Now COVID, fast forward this, right? Because now all of a sudden people discover that we could actually do our jobs from anywhere. But it also is a matter of like, yeah, can't you hire a business development person sitting in West Africa, and they don't have to be sitting in, you know, Watertown? Yeah, like they're like, oh yeah, we could just do that. And where do we find people living in? Well, we have offices there. You know, just hire them to sit outside of that office, because most of the offices were like project focused. So like, then all of a sudden you're hiring people in the region, in the country, well, any country they want to work out of. It doesn't really care. So that has been a mindset shift as far as operations. And I will say operations versus implementation of work. Implementation, I would venture to say most of our organizations got. There's 5,000 doctors in Africa and Asia. I mean, let's face it, they're highly educated people, right? So that wasn't it. It was the operations part. And I think that's the system that we built to help for our role, our key role in all of this. I still think that translating some of this is harder. And I will say that after spending time in Haiti. And it was probably the biggest eye-opener of my life to understand that a lot of money post-earthquake went into Haiti, and then NGOs were bad. You remember the article was the country of NGOs or something. It was very bad to be an NGO in Haiti then, which was weird. But what it really came down to is it was a lot of money being thrown at people and no real infrastructure into systems of managing the money. And then it was a lot of blame when it didn't go well. And so I think that people got overly tight, overly focused on that, and so now it's applied to all countries. And again, we said they're not all the same, and so you have to get into a little bit of this. Getting back to your original question of how do organizations pivot? I think some of it is, you're right, we should have been thinking about this before, but I will also say some of this is this idea that cheaper, and I will say if you leave with nothing else other than it shouldn't be necessarily cheaper to move your operations, move your center of your operations to Asia, Africa, Middle East, wherever, where the work you're doing is focused on. Because you should be paying people fairly. You should be setting up the infrastructures. You should have operational systems. Now, cost of living may vary, but depending, if you've been to Kenya, Nigeria, cost of living is not that different South Africa and some of the other places. So it's just their center of the universe. I think it's a mindset shift happening at organizations, but I also think it is something that we don't always recognize that we perpetuate. Because people at my organization, former people have left, have made public remarks that we've moved cheaper, that we've gone cheaper because we hired someone who's based in the DRC versus based in Watertown. And so they didn't think of it as I did, as purely racist, but they thought it, they did. That's how I interpret it. But in their heads, they were like, but you higher quality people are here because that's what they're used to. And I think we know that clearly is not correct.
You mentioned that your organization was also in between, and you would love for a time for it to be out, right?
Yeah, so we are intermediary organization, and we do not have physical presence in countries. So we really partner with civil society organizations, and they plan and implement policy advocacy campaigns. So I think what I said was like maybe 3-4 years ago, should intermediary even exist, or should not, because I think there are like intermediary taking money actually takes money away from the resources away from the local civil society organizations. But I think I came to a point where we have complex challenges. Really, it's just not one problem that we are trying to address. And I think the way I understand shifting power is from the perspective of everyone having a place. I think in international development, but I think those who monopolized the international development world, I think, should strive towards building equitable partnerships with local civil society organizations, other local actors also. But I think in some contexts you can help, but you need an intermediary. I think international NGOs that used to directly deliver services should position themselves to play that role, intermediary role. With of course smaller resources than they used to get. So that is a trade-off. But I don't know how far this conversation is going to go. I'm not too optimistic about the commitment also. That's why I want to see it codified in the law, so that there will be congressional oversight, there will be accountability. There won't just be a commitment, we celebrate, and then nothing happens.
Just to also very quickly come in on, one of the things that's happening now though is I think we are at a point in time where increasingly organizations are realizing, or will have to realize, that they cannot use that excuse of it's just a funder anymore. So right now, I know of dozens of movements and networks that are being created, pledges that are being made, where organizations are actually thinking of, okay, yes, there are issues that are coming from the funder, and there are systemic issues, but there are also issues that around things that we have been doing, our own processes and practices that need to change. For instance, overheads. How much overheads are we putting into the sub-grants for the local organizations? Can we make a commitment that we will, at least in the proposals that we put in, ensure that the overheads for local organizations are taking into account what they need, right? So there is that change that's happening. Or ethical storytelling, there's a whole movement around that. There's a whole movement around just taking from local organizations their information, their data, their pictures, and putting it out as ours,
Yeah.
and kind of getting that.
Yeah.
So I think we are at a point where organizations are beginning to understand that they cannot get away with this.
Maybe I
Yeah.
just want to add, I think I would love to see symposiums like this happen in, Addis Ababa or other countries where local organizations can actually be invited to speak, because we really want to create demand also. I know, there are movements. I have seen open letters from coalitions, from Global South coalitions, for demanding more funding and more resources, more decision-making power. It shouldn't just be, the entity that gives power shouldn't just be international NGO and donor. I think it's important that the governments need to demand it. I think civil society organizations need to demand it, because I have friends who work with international NGOs. They haven't heard of what localization is, or at this moment, they have no idea. And they also think that local civil society organizations do not have capacity. Because, this is, it also, to a certain extent, it touches their position also. They want to stay relevant also in that environment, right? So they need to advocate for international NGOs because they are affiliated with international NGOs.
Absolutely, and I think you raised a very important point about the mindset change, right? I think somewhere all of us have to, there is a process of unlearning, and it's very difficult when it's for yourself, right? Because we are all in this sector, we all believe we have the right intentions. We all believe we stand for equity, we stand for justice, we stand for inclusion, right? To reconcile yourself to the fact that you may yourself hold values, you may consider somebody who doesn't speak the same language or doesn't speak English as fluently, doesn't speak multiple languages, has not traveled the way you have traveled, hasn't the same university degrees that you have, knows more than you about that context. It's very difficult. And so we often talk about mindset shift in our sector. I think what shifting power requires is a mindset shift within ourselves, our organizations, but also us as individuals, to do that and to see how do we do this within our own teams, within our own partners and with our own partners, right? Chris, I wanted to ask you, bring you back into the conversation a little bit around what can organizations do, right? And so from the example of the Global Fund, are there practices? Are there things that were put into place? And I know you touched upon some of it initially when you talked about the difference you saw in countries, but let's go a little more into that. What kind of framing was there within the rules or within the grants or the work that the Global Fund did to enable more community participation?
It's structured in at every level. It is not left to it's all about local implementation. Everything is, but the rules are there to help people make this a reality. So, civil society is on the board as a voting seat. Southern NGOs are on the board. The rule is that civil society and people affected by diseases are engaged at the country level in the country coordinating mechanism to develop the concept note for Global Fund spending in that country. There is a real effort to fund community systems, to fund human rights work in addition, to try to make the change on the contextual issues in terms of community engagement. Community-based organizations are eligible for financing. There is some support for advocacy and community-led monitoring. But there's just an expectation that community be involved and that services be human rights based, and that we get at issues around discrimination against key populations, women and girls, prisoners, and others. So it's structured in. And I think that's, I think we need to see a lot more of that in a lot more organizations. I would also include, the point that you raised, there's an advocacy agenda here in terms of changing USAID and gaining way more transparency from USAID about what they're doing to structure in and insist and hold accountable grantees around contracting with communities and involving communities in decision making. That should be, ideally one day we'll talk about USAID the way we talk about Global Fund and talk about all those different ways that you're supposed to, not that it works perfectly, it does not, but that you are at least supposed to include civil society at every level. Why doesn't USAID have the same rules? I don't know.
Yeah.
See, I do not work for the Global Fund. But I want to say that I think what Chris is saying is very, very important. And it's not just that civil society is involved as a recipient or beneficiary. They are there at the decision-making process from the beginning as leaders. And that's a big difference for Global Fund and a lot of other organizations. And that's what he means when he says it's in the structure. I don't know of many other organizations like that require civil society to be part of the whole entire process, the conceptualization down to implementation. And that empowerment, I think, is critical. Because oftentimes we carry our own unconscious biases about what programs should look like before the programs even come. And so we try and structure it around them and tell the civil society to fit into this box. And the Global Fund spins that on its head and is just like, no, this is you all, what do you want to do? How is this going to look? And we will fund it. And that's completely different than almost anything. I do not work for the Global Fund. It is incredible. I've been doing global health for a long time, and it's unique, and it needs to be amplified more.
But it should be the standard everywhere.
It should absolutely.
And again, it doesn't work perfectly at all. It needs to do better. There's I'm not saying Global Fund doesn't need to do better too, but at least it is structured in. There's the expectation, and we don't see that in so much of health. Not to pick on them, but I think we need to have our eyes open too, because the fallback for a lot of institutions is absolutely to do the opposite. Right? So when you saw the first memo from the World Bank about their new financial intermediary fund on pandemics, 0 implementing countries on the board, 0 civil society on the board. Now, the answer we got was, well, no, we're going to correct that. That's just our standard contract. It's like, yeah, that's your standard way of doing it. Right. That's the point. The standard is you don't involve civil society if you're a World Bank. We heard someone from the World Bank, I'm sure a very dedicated, good person, speak yesterday saying they had never, until this fund came along and civil society screamed and yelled bloody murder when civil society and implementing countries weren't part of the board. Until that, this person said they'd been at the bank for a long, long time and had never had the engagement with civil society over that entire time. This was said yesterday in plenary. That's amazing, right? The World Bank has been allowed to operate in such a non-representative, top-down way. It's completely paternalistic and colonialist, and it's unbelievable that the bank was able to issue a memo 6 months ago that embedded those colonialist approaches into something. So anyway, they, when everyone screamed and yelled, change happened in that one place. So that's the good side of the story, right? Is even the bank can be those processes. If people scream loud enough, things can change, and that's the empowering part. And that's the other side of the equation. I was saying in my first answer is we've all got to get our systems of financing and power to be more accountable and build in and structure in civil society engagement. But in the end of the day, civil society has to scream and yell.
But the spaces for that are also shrinking, I think, and that's part of the challenge.
Well, that's right.
I was very concerned to hear the other day for the Summit for the Future, for instance, where the UN has now decided we'll not allow civil society to come in virtually. So all the small local organizations who could come in are not able to come in now. Or, we've had these summits happening in the US, the Democracy Summit, the Africa Business Summit and stuff, where the decisions have been taken to limit civil society participation. And I think part of that is also how do we fight this? Because this is not just happening in countries like in India or Ethiopia and stuff, it's also happening at a global level, right?
Absolutely.
You've had your hand up.
Yeah, thanks. I'm gonna put this off to speak if that's okay. My name's Laura Hemeke, consultant. This is such a great conversation, and I also don't work for the Global Fund. I echo everything you said, 'cause I remember back in the day, everyone talked about country-led and country-driven, and nobody was really doing it. And I do think the Global Fund does that, even though it can be a very bumpy ride when it's country-driven. So I really admire that. It's just, I also wanted to share a couple of resources that I think are so relevant to this discussion. And one is in 2008, Health Action International, HAI, I think they're Seattle-based, developed something called the Code of Conduct for the Health System Strengthening Code of Conduct for International NGOs, or something like that. And it touched on all these principles around how do you pay people, how do you not create parallel data systems for your project instead of strengthening the system that's there.
Right.
So there are several principles of the code, and I know it well because I actually, when I was trying to find a topic for my dissertation, I stumbled across it, and it provided like a perfect framework for analyzing what international NGOs are doing. So, my dissertation's out there. I never wrote the 5 articles I was going to write because I got too busy. But it's called "First Do No Harm: The Evolving Role of International NGOs in Health System Strengthening." And what I learned from that process is we talk about health system strengthening. It rolls off your tongue now, but it really wasn't in the literature till around 2010, kind of. And every agency had a different definition for it, including. But I think what's so important here is, again, that the country-driven. One more resource that's a great resource that nobody knows about is called the Lives and Livelihood Fund. It's a $2.5 billion fund that I have the pleasure of supporting through the Gates Foundation. The Gates Foundation is one of the donors. And I won't monopolize, this is not my commercial, but I think these are important things that people don't know about. Like Lives and Livelihood Fund is a huge resource and pot of money, basically, that countries can apply to. It's managed by the Islamic Development Bank. Countries have to be members of the bank. And that includes, as you can imagine, all the wealthiest countries in the world, but also many of the poorest countries in the world. All of Francophone West and Central Africa, Mozambique, Uganda. I encourage you to look at it. They have their website finally. But the fund is being renewed for a second 5-year phase. And I want everyone to know about it because you can go to ministries of health in these countries and say, look, you can apply for this funding. It's concessional financing, it's 40% grant, 60% loan for most countries. But again, this resource that just talk about it. And if you can go to a government and say, we'll work with you, there's a role for local organizations, community-based organizations, international organizations. So again, that's my commercial, but thanks, this discussion is great. Thanks for your patience.
I have a couple more hands. I want to, okay. With the last row, and then we'll continue.
Thank you so much. I'm not going to say I don't work for Global Fund. Okay, we're on the trajectory. I had actually a question since I got here about Global Fund. So I guess, is it 2008, 2009, something like that, the conversation around community health subsystems and defining that and community system strengthening, and that's all out of Global Fund, right? And so one of the things I kept looking for was, this is what we've been looking for. I've done a lot of work in health equity here in the US, and we're Global North, so this is where we've come to because of non-communicable diseases, right? I think one of the things that I've seen, or that I saw with this framework and this thinking and this definition, was really beginning to speak to that social determinants of health piece, that now we're kind of like, okay, it's global health equity. We've got all the cool language now, so great. But I haven't necessarily heard the marketing of the successes of what Global Fund has been able to do with that framework more recently. I think one of the things that we know this, and I think this is why you're here, is that HIV/AIDS work is fundamentally based on everything that we're trying to get to at this point. Targeting and reaching to the folks most vulnerable for any number of reasons across the world. There's some significant lessons that have been learned, but it sounds like after all of the after-action reviews, after all of the fabulous learned lessons that we've had, we've still not gotten to the place where we're able to highlight, celebrate, and then transition or share or sort of pull from with where we're moving forward. So I'm not sure that I'm seeing the building upon what's already been provided as a foundation. And like I said, I just haven't seen it, and I don't know if that's something that we need to figure out how to do better. The other piece of this is you talked about, and I love what you both were sharing, is this idea that the reality check is on the ground, there are two things that are happening. You've got internal national governments distrusting their own local coalitions and civil society organizations. We've seen this in China, and I'm not going to get into a political upheaval, right? Like we're not, but we work in China, and interestingly enough, our organization was the only one allowed in with UNICEF to address their Left Behind Children's program for a number of reasons. And so there's a whole conversation to be had about that, but there's something about how do we get to the people who are going to do the work, whether or not we, the global we, are there or not, and how do we encourage, strengthen, empower them to have stronger relationships with their national governments, their local governments, so that they can continue to be a trusted voice. Because we know that's where the change is going to be maintained. So whether it's a commentary, whether it's a question, I just wanted to share that with you because I think there's so much that Global Fund has been able to do. There's so much that People's Movement, there's so much there. Why are we not consolidating?
I think that's a great question, but I am, in the interest of time, going to come to you first before coming to the panelists.
Hi, I'm Lena. I work preventing pandemics at the source, and I love what you said about what Priya Basu from the World Bank said of having this first civil society real engagement when building what's now called the Pandemic Fund. But my question is, how do you think we can go further than that? Because it was structured from the very beginning as a financial intermediary fund. So it was the intermediaries were really embedded in the structure of the fund. And we've been pushing for direct funding to local organizations to not go through all of these big intermediaries, which are really inefficient in terms of overheads. I mean, they do really great work, but it is going to take away a lot of resources from work on the ground around pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response. So how do we go further than that? Because it's really hard. We've heard, oh, it's inefficient, we can't do it, it would require too many resources. How do we really build the case for direct funding at the World Bank, which is very, very used to doing these financial intermediary funds?
Great. I think one thing I am hearing through all of this, Chris, though, is that you basically have to figure out a way to really document some of what the Global Fund did and put it out there for institutions like USAID, like the World Bank and others, to say it is possible, it is doable. It's not easy. These would be the challenges, but it was done.
Yeah.
And this is what we learned along the way. At least that's what I am hearing here, that there is a huge need for that.
Yeah.
But does anyone want to try and attempt to answer the World Bank question?
Well, I'll just give my quick opinion. One is, I will start with, I am not for another fund. So I'll just be I can't, because inevitably another fund means another system, another structure set up. We spend 2 years of who's in charge, who's it gonna go through, who's on the board, I've just seen this happen so many times. So I'll start with, I'm anti-fund, new fund. I just feel like we have enough already that exists. Figure out how to use one of these structures, and if it doesn't work, fix it. Why doesn't it work? And I think we've learned so much over the years, whether we wanted to or not, on how to do this better. We literally went through this with Ebola, where we talked and so we went further with, COVID. But I just feel like we spent a lot of time meeting and talking when we already know how to solve the problem. Get them the money to get them the systems. Now, the World Bank in particular is unique because they're a government to government system, right? But I do think it goes back to what Chris said is, even if it's government, civil society has to participate in their own government. And we know how important that is. Now, again, that's the caveat with every government, is not the same. And I don't think we should think World Bank should treat them the same. But I do think that, because there are some governments you should not go through, and there are some civil society, but there are other governments you should be going through and not bypassing them to do this. And I think, again, taking that nuanced approach to this is what I would push the World Bank to do, because I do think that I don't feel as comfortable being a champion and saying go government to government only or go civil society only to civil society, because I think you're creating the exact same problem that you're trying to solve. Every country is different. Let's nuance. What is the issue? What are we trying to do? There's some cases that, for me, health system strengthening, community systems, primary health care, government has to have a role in this somewhere, because they are the ones connecting the dots between these pieces. And when they don't, that's where the breakdowns happen between the last mile and the community, and then the community and the regional, and then the regional and the national. So I just think that pushing them to take a nuanced approach to these things based on years and years of experience just in this room alone of working in these countries, to say, here's what we think your recommendation should do. And here are 15 organizations. Let me get you their phone numbers and their emails that you can contact directly. So all this whole I don't know where to find them thing, we're done with that. Literally our role as these INGOs is make a list. What topic do you want? Health? Here's health. Do you want health system strength? Here's another list. I feel like we gotta stop with this. We can't find the people either, which I think is also kind of the World Bank thing, where we can we don't know where to look. We only knew the 5 organizations that are around our office, here. So I think that's a role that we can have, and I think it's an important role to play really seriously, because many of us have staff, country, teams on the ground who really can say that, you really should be looking at this organization and this organization for these things to connect the dots. Here really is their contact information, and here's what you need to pay them so that they can get to this meeting. Maybe we'll go half on you with this or something, but creating, like you were talking about, creating these opportunities. COVID gave us the benefit, because never in my wildest dreams did I have this many people on a line who English wasn't their first language, because we could pay for an interpreter simultaneously right there, and that made it more accessible. And it was a small thing, and I feel like people got open. They were like, well, wait, is this what we've been missing all these years, that we haven't been able to come to New York or come to Geneva? They were a part of the conversation, and I don't think they're going to go backwards on that. But it is very easy to close off the conversation again. Be like, well, we're meeting in person, so we can't pay for translation. You're like, well, figure it out. And I think us demanding that too from, again, the INGO side, it's really important.
Thanks so much, Crystal. You beautifully kind of segued into what was going to be my last question, not just for the 3 of you, but for everyone here. I think you raised a very important point when you started by asking, well, it's easy to say the funders need to do this, USAID needs to do this, that, but what is it that we can do? And that's where we're going to be looking at now. I want to ask everybody here in this room, we've all talked about what others need to do in some sense. Well, what is it that we are committing to doing to shift the power? What is it that we say we can do individually or organizationally, personally or professionally, to make this a reality? And what we'll do is, I'll start with you, Wilishe. Then I'll come here and see if anybody in the room has something they want to share. Then I'll come to Crystal room, and then we end. Yeah.
Okay, so I will say, I personally, I will continue advocating for, shifting power, allocating more resources to, local civil society organizations, as well as local governments. I think, to your point, there are diverse governments and government systems out there, and many health systems are run by governments, unlike here in the US. So I will continue doing that. Personally, I'm passionate about this topic. Organizationally, we've been working with local civil society organizations for some time now, and we will continue, co-creating projects. We are not perfect, but we will co-create. We will give room for making mistakes, learning, for them to learn by doing, and also be patient, right? Especially when it comes to advocacy, there is this cliche, the advocacy is not a sprint, it's a long distance run, so it requires patience. So.
Thank you. And I'm going to do something now which I haven't done so far, which is request everybody to limit their comments a bit because we are running up against time. So we'll start with you. Thank you. Yes, please.
I would just say quickly, no matter where you are, check your privilege, because we have privilege no matter where we are. So when I'm here in the States, I'm usually the only Black American in the room. So I have a perspective that usually blows people's minds when I'm talking. I think it's normal. But like Chris will say, oh, that was racist from her perspective, of course, right? But the people didn't mean it that way, right? So in this space, I'm in a minority and I have different perspectives that could lend something to the room. But when I go to Africa and Asia, guess what? I have to check my privilege and take a different posture and become the learner in the room and start to ask questions. So I say no matter where you are, check your privilege and it'll go a long way towards quote unquote localization.
Lovely. Thank you. Chris.
Well, I commit
Do a little bit of ping pong.
Yeah. This has been a really, really great conversation for me. What will I do? So, joint learning. That's what a lot of it is about for like where I work. And we do have a project that's actually called that, joint learning, where we partner with advocates in other countries and we try to learn from each other and support each other. And it's hard to know how to do that, and we need more money in it. We need to actually get money to them to support their work. That's the first thing I'd like to do in that project. And it's hard to identify that, but I commit to continue to try to grow the joint learning work that we're doing. I commit to do more to try to get